when we talk about misperception and decision making as sources of war, we always talk about World War I, and so I'm going to spend a little bit of time digging into some aspects of World War I, both how there were misperceptions by leaders and by people in general, but also about how organizational process and standard operating procedures really led to disaster in that case. In the next segment, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so what we're doing essentially is contrasting a case where there was a lot of misperception and some wonky organizational process that caused one of the worst wars in history. And then when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, there was a fair amount of the same stuff. But of course, that's a case where another really dangerous war was avoided, right? The Soviet Union and the United States avoided going to war in 1962. And so they make for an interesting contrast with one another. But let's talk about World War I. So first of all, misperceptions. And there are books and bookshelves full of books written about the origins of World War I, and there are entire books written in particular about the psychology of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. He was seen as being very insecure and therefore trying to prove things to everybody. Similar things have been written in particular about the Tsar of Russia. So I'm giving you just the thinnest gloss on some of the things that historians point to. One of the reasons we talk so much about World War I is not only was it so clearly a war that everybody rushed into, and yet afterwards everybody regarded it as a huge mistake, but it's also a case where the diplomatic records have been preserved, and so we know a lot about what happened. So here are some of the big ones, right? First of all, there was this German belief, the entire German plan leading to World War I was built on this idea that it could defeat France before Russia mobilized, right? The whole German goal was to avoid fighting France and Russia at the same time. And that's what the Schlieffen Plan was based on. And you could argue that it was motivated bias, right? Things looked pretty bad for Germany if it couldn't, if it had to fight a two-front war. So there was a lot of emotional reason to believe that they could avoid that through this Schlieffen Plan. For sort of similar reasons, Germany believed that England would not join the war. There were probably better reasons to believe that England would not join the war, but again, there was maybe a psychological need to believe it because it was one thing to fight France and Russia. It was another thing to fight France and Russia and England. Everybody believed, all over Europe, people believed that the war would be over quickly and that therefore it wouldn't be costly. There wouldn't be a lot of death. There wouldn't be a lot of destruction. And that was largely based on the previous big war in Europe, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71, which was over in about 6 weeks. There was a belief that the offense had a decisive advantage. In other words, when you got close to going war, whoever struck first was likely to have a big advantage and to win the war. And that had, you can imagine, a very negative effect on diplomacy because everybody was worried that if they kept on negotiating, they might lose the chance to go first. And that could be disastrous. Therefore, there was this general belief that concessions would lead to disaster, in particular the idea that the balance of power in Europe was very finely balanced, and that if Russia got stronger, Germany would be doomed, or Russia believed that if Germany got stronger, Russia was going to be doomed. And so there was this idea that you simply couldn't give anything, or that in the long run, you were going to be finished. So in order to understand a lot of what happened, you have to understand the German war plan. And I apologize for the fact that this map is in German, but I think you can understand it without knowing German. It's amazing how hard it was to find on the internet a map of the Schlieffen Plan that showed both the eastern and western components of it, the plan against Russia and France, because almost all the maps are only about France. The point is this. The goal, again, is to avoid fighting a two-front war against France and Russia at the same time. If you're Germany, which here is the D for Deutschland. This is just an outline of Germany as it existed prior to World War I. So the idea was Russia is a very big country. It's a backward country, not much in the way of railroads. The estimate it was going to take 40 days from the time they started to mobilize. It would take 40 days for Russia to get its troops to this border here, the eastern border of Germany. The idea was, in the meantime, you would take France out. You would do a rapid strike. This is Luxembourg and Belgium, the L and the B. And the idea was that France's defense was where these X's are. You couldn't fight them, but you could go through Luxembourg and Belgium quite easily and circle Paris from behind. Right? So it was going to be a battle of maneuver and therefore you wouldn't have to fight the strength of the French army. You would go behind them, knock France out of the war very quickly. The Schlieffen Plan, therefore, and by the way, it's called the Schlieffen Plan out of the German general who concocted it. So the key was to defeat France before Russia mobilizes, but of course Russia knew this. And so for Russia the key was, and for France the key was, once you think you're in danger of going to war, you've got to start Russian mobilization so that 40-day window starts shrinking, right? The window in which France might have to fight Germany by itself starts shrinking. Problem, of course, is once Russia starts mobilizing, Germany sees that window shrinking, and it feels compelled then, we've got to go now. And so the war planning itself basically completely short-circuited any efforts at diplomacy. And so they almost couldn't think about whether they wanted to go to war. It was simply this question of, if there's going to be a war, we have to go because otherwise we might lose. That became particularly true because of the rail timetables. Right? This was an era in which trucks were brand new and not very reliable. So actually the horse and horse-pulled carriage was still one of the main modes of transport in World War I, but really it was about railroads. Right? Well, railroad timetables are almost the very definition or epitome of standard operating procedures. And that was what was required to get troops to the front and to get them supplied. And of course they needed massive amounts of supply. So rail schedules had to be very precise, or the rail lines end up blocked, the empty cars going back interfere with the new ones coming up. So they had these very, very complicated and precise train schedules. The problem was, once mobilization started then, you couldn't stop it, because if you did, it would throw these timetables into complete chaos. So once mobilization started, you hadn't really made a decision to go to war yet, but once mobilization started, you almost were trapped by the rail timetables. And so that's essentially what happened. Is the cautious thing to do was to start mobilizing just in case, especially for Russia, just in case you ended up in war. But once you started mobilization, you couldn't stop, and the Germans looked at that situation and said, well, we've got to go for it. And that's what happened. So the Schlieffen Plan in the West, we don't need to go too far into this, but the key point was this. In order to avoid the strength of the French army and make things go quickly, the path of least resistance was to go through northern France, and to get to northern France, you had to go through Belgium and the Netherlands. Belgium and the Netherlands were both neutral. They had sided with neither of the big alliances, and in 1914, maybe more so than now, neutrality was considered to be sacred. And so when Germany violated Belgium's neutrality, that, as well as just the general threat to Europe, that ended any uncertainty into Britain as to whether they wanted to get in the war at all. So this is the plan, but this is not what happened. In fact, as soon as the Germans moved into Belgium, the British brought what was called the British Expeditionary Force across, and basically the German army ran into them here in the middle of France, and that's where the lines bogged down for the next 4 years. So in some respects, the part of the plan that involved violating Belgium's neutrality guaranteed that it wouldn't work. And yet nobody seemed to think this through ahead of time. So hindsight is 20/20. It's 100 years afterwards. It's easy for us to say, wow, they were morons. But very few people saw these things at the time. Why? Right? Why was there such this rapid period, in fact, in which something that looked pretty straightforward, and there was a lot of consensus around it at the time, in retrospect, by the 1920s, people looked back and said this was nuts. And what does that tell us about our ability to manage these things intellectually? Can we really be rational? So that's a big question that we want to ask. So just to bring up to us a more current example, if we think about standard operating procedures in the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, there's a lot to be said about that invasion. I'm just going to make one particular point, which is, and I used to do some work with actually the people who were the head planners of that invasion. And they basically said, we had a really good plan for defeating the Iraqi army, right? That's what war planners do. And of course, the United States had all kinds of advantages. They said, but nobody ever really emphasized or told us that we needed to plan for what happened after we defeated the Iraqi army, right? An army thinks of its mission as defeating the other army. So the so-called what was caused Phase 4 had barely, a page or a couple pages of planning, the so-called post-combat operations, because that was not seen to be the important part of the mission. As we know, once the Iraqi army was defeated, anarchy and chaos broke out in Iraq, and then there was this insurgency, and the U.S. military was completely unprepared for that. It simply wasn't assumed to be an issue because it wasn't a normal part of military planning, right? Militaries plan to win wars, not to run countries. So that's just a more modern example. And again, in retrospect, it was easy to say, how could you not think of running Iraq afterwards? And the answer is nobody thought that there was going to be anarchy, right? People thought that they were going to say, hooray, the Americans are here, now we can build democracy. It's not how it went. So one of the, I think, interesting questions to ask is, where are the similar misperceptions today? If we look around at what our country is doing or other countries are doing, are there similar disasters awaiting us? And I'm not saying that there are. I'm not meaning to imply anything conspiratorial. I just think it's interesting when we look back at mistakes to ask, how is it possible that we're subject to the same kinds of mistakes? We like to think we wouldn't be so stupid. We'll have to find out.